This is Dialog ASEAN25 with me, Naila Huda. And this week, leaders from across the region gathered for the 46th ASEAN Summit in Kuala Lumpur, where they discussed, among other things, how they want to move forward together towards a shared future. That becomes the basis for the new document the leaders signed together in Kuala Lumpur, or the Kuala Lumpur Declaration, also titled the ASEAN Community Vision 2045, a document detailing the strategic direction of where the regional bloc wants to move forward for the next 2 decades. But does this document offer enough direction, enough strategy and guidance, especially at a crucial time when the region needs to navigate so much global uncertainty? Joining me today to help unpack some of these questions, these concerns, we have Joanne Lin Wei Ling, Senior Fellow of the ASEAN Study Centre of ISIA's Yusof Ishak Institute, Faisal Karim, Associate Professor of International Relations, Universitas Islam International Indonesia, or IIIU, and we also have Daisy Pane, Senior Fellow, Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies. Thank you so much, Joanne, Faisal and Daisy, for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
First up, we want to just get a general idea of some of the key takeaways of the summit this time around. Maybe perhaps we can start with Joanne. Looking at the summit, some of the milestones, the achievements in just these 2-3 days of meetings, what would be the key takeaways for this summit?
Yeah, thank you, Naila, for having me. As you mentioned earlier, I guess one of the biggest outcomes was the adoption of the ASEAN New Vision 2045, which lays out a 20-year roadmap. So it is actually a more forward-looking vision compared to the previous one, and it comes at a time when the region is really grappling with a much more unpredictable global environment. So at the same time, I would say the summit didn't shy away from more immediate challenges. So the leaders adopted a strong statement on global trade uncertainties in response to Trump 2.0 tariffs. So Malaysia also pushed for a more action-oriented approach on Myanmar, including suggestions for permanent ASEAN Special Envoy. That was also the inaugural ASEAN GCC China Summit, which I'm sure we can talk about later. Is quite unprecedented for first summit of the year, and that actually signifies ASEAN's growing ambition to actually diversify its partnership. So I would say that overall this summit shows that ASEAN is trying to match long-term vision with the real world action.
Faisal, what about you? Your key takeaways from the summit?
Yeah, thank you. I think one of the most important thing is that, as like Joanne said, it's more about how to basically having a 20 years of future plan. But more importantly, I think economically, ASEAN leaders finally agreed to basically enhance intra-trade or intra-regional trade and investment, because as you can see with the rise of Trump 2.0, seemingly ASEAN, we thought, is a kind of a one cohesive organization, but it turns out, when Trump asked for, unilateral negotiation, suddenly all of the ASEAN members seemingly run for themselves. So in a way, I think it's kind of interesting to see how finally ASEAN need to agree on the necessity of enhancing intra-regional trade, and also I think, as Joanne said, forward thinking, let's discuss about new venue of economic cooperation, such as green finance, which is very much overlooked, digital transformations as well, and more importantly, I think supply chain connectivity, given the fact that seemingly ASEAN country has been very much incorporated into China's sphere of supply chain, while supply chain currently has been weaponized. So in a way, understanding how this supply chain resilience need to be also put in on board. I think that I can add to this kind of a key takeaway. Thank you.
Daisy, what do you make of this? What stood out to you the most from the summit?
Yeah, thank you, Naila. The ASEAN Summit sent a strong message of strategic autonomy. I think, like Joanne and Faisal mentioned about the most important thing is the launch of ASEAN 2045 vision. And also, there's a further effort to deepen internal trade and investment by making priority on initiatives like digital economy framework agreement and also the upgrade of the ASEAN trade in goods agreement. And also the effort to diversify our partnership beyond major powers, such as engagement with the Gulf Cooperation Council and China. And also the ASEAN leaders also reaffirm its principle of neutrality while staying active, engaged in global economic system. And also on the regional stability and expansion, the ASEAN Summit also try to overcome Myanmar crisis, even though, yeah, there are still many things to do. And also there are discussion or the membership expansion. Timor-Leste was officially welcome as the ASEAN 11 members, and also discussion were initiated regarding the Papua New Guinea potential membership to strengthen the bloc's global influence. I think that's some my takeaways.
Yeah.
Before we look at the next 20 years, and of course we want to focus on the ASEAN community vision, before that maybe we can reflect a little bit on what has happened in the past. The ASEAN Community Vision 2045, of course we know, replaces the ASEAN 2025 document, Forging Ahead Together, which was adopted 10 years back in 2015, thus guiding the overall development of ASEAN, where it's been headed for the past decade. So what I guess I want to ask Joanne this. What do you make of the past 10 years, some of the milestones? What has or hasn't been achieved with ASEAN 2025?
Right. So I believe that the ASEAN Community Vision 2025 really laid out an important foundation for deepening regional integration over the past decade. So it helps to actually solidify the three community pillars, which are the political security, economic, and social culture, and actually had guided ASEAN through a relatively, I would say, stable period marked by institutional consolidation and norms building. So during this period, I think ASEAN has actually achieved some great key milestones, including the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, and strengthening regional cooperation on non-traditional security like disaster response, counterterrorism, and also, of course, laying the groundwork for greater social culture connectivity. But I would also say that the past decade has also exposed some limitations of ASEAN, because ASEAN struggled to respond decisively to very fast-moving geopolitical tensions like the South China Sea and the Myanmar crisis. So while the 2025 vision helped to anchor ASEAN's community building, I think it also revealed actually the need for a more adaptive and strategic framework, and that is actually what the new Vision 2045 is aiming to address. But in generally, I think ASEAN has done well for its community building and consolidation. Yeah.
Faisal, earlier you mentioned about greater, deeper regional financial integration or intra-regional integration. If you want to look and reflect a little bit on the past or where we're at currently, is there still a long way to go? What has been some of the success or gaps in the past 10 years when we're talking about financial integration?
Well, definitely. I mean, as usual, blueprint is just a kind of a vision that we want to achieve, right? The planning approach, there is the blueprint is beautifully written about how to increase economic, political, socio-cultural security, and also there is also strategic ambition. We heard about, ASEAN master plan on connectivity, and also in terms of monitoring, I think ASEAN 2025 has a scorecard already, self-assessment. But the problems is, despite of this nicely, beautifully written vision, at the end of the day, it's all about implementations, right? And how we need to achieve this scorecard. And I think I agree. Despite of that limitation, we see for the past 20 years, ASEAN can actually consolidate a lot of things. Our CEP, ASEAN +1, ASEAN +3, and so on and so forth. And somehow we can, despite of issue of COVID-19 and how this lead to kind of a rivalry among us in terms of, building our own resilience. But at the end of the day, we finally able to move it as a one community. But I think I need to highlight the thing that we need to understand is that the shift on the geo-economic, we never heard about, Indo-Pacific prior to this, because when ASEAN 2025 being created, we thought that, the so-called multipolar order will be put in place, and China will be rise peacefully, but it turns out it's not as we expect. And then somehow there is a pushback from the external power, especially with the creations of seemingly organization or platform that undermine ASEAN. And in a way, I think, despite all that external challenges and the rise of minilateral platform, I think ASEAN as a one can basically respond to that. We heard about ASEAN Outlook on Indo-Pacific. So despite of the planning, and then the planning seemingly doesn't really engage with those kind of issue, we can basically flexibly, try to figure out, navigate, and somehow manage our ASEAN centrality. And I think we always emphasize in inclusivity, cooperation, despite of the pressure to take a side. And I don't know, for the next 20 years, will we need to take a side? That will be a good question that ASEAN policy makers needs to answer. Yeah.
A lot of points there that we want to unpack. Was it Joanne? Did you have something to say, Joanne, or?
Yes, I mean, I actually agree with Faisal on what he said, because, right now the world that we are living in is changing very fast. And of course, ASEAN needs to adapt. We can't actually keep to the previous mode of consensus making, decision making process, that sort of thing. So I guess unlike the more integrated focus and the inward looking vision of 2025, I think this new framework, actually, the Vision 2045, actually recognize that ASEAN is now operating in a far more fractured and uncertain global landscape, exactly what Faisal said. So it's about transformation, it's not only about community building. So therefore, I think that it needs to be a stronger focus on institutional reform. ASEAN needs to project its relevance, on the global stage. So I would agree that the substance is all there, but whether member states will have the political will and the collective discipline to deliver on it, it's the key question. As Faisal, you said, implementation is as important as, having a lot of documents or a lot of statements.
Again, a lot of interesting points there. The fact that implementation is quite contingent on political will and discipline, as you mentioned, Joanne, because if we were to rely on authority, on policies or legally binding institutions, there aren't any. There's no authoritative body, right? But before we go to that, Daisy, any thoughts on this? Reflecting on the past and now, the main problem seems to be implementation, right? You can come up with the fanciest document there is, but will it actually get done? What do you think, Daisy?
Yes, I agree with Joan and Faisal. The implementation is still a problem because they are different country, different regulatory, different framework, uneven development across member states. So that's the problem. We have Singapore, we have Myanmar, we are different, but still, I think ASEAN quite successful in integration with the RCEP and also with the ASEAN Plus. I think the in trade we quite successful, but we have so many homework to do, especially how to integrate different situation in different countries.
I mean, Faisal, going back to that, you mentioned this greater need for consolidation, right? And Joanne was touching on political will and discipline. But could we imagine greater authority or something that's more binding to act as an incentive, or perhaps a mix of a carrot and stick for member states to actually keep to their word?
Yeah, I think it's a kind of a old debates on ASEAN, whether we need to operate in a consensus base, in a very what we call as a soft law, or a soft institutionalizations. And I think partly people might argue that that what makes ASEAN works, because we try to come up with things that everyone's agreed on. But the problems is with the growing, increasing, fracture and fragmentation. I think I agree it's not really feasible. So whether the question is it possible? I think it is. And how can we start? I think it can start from strengthening the secretariat. That's the first thing, because as of now, secretariat is just a kind of a body that basically supporting whatever agenda that created by a member states. So having a stronger and more institutionalized secretariat will be the first step to do so, not necessarily the main important one. I think secondly, I think the most important one perhaps was to make sure that in terms of normative or institution, we can basically create a kind of institution whereby all of the member state that may not part of the agenda being agreed on, and somehow seemingly co-opted, for instance, by external power, can be basically not penalized in a sense, but more about uh, being making made to be in line. Perhaps it's a really difficult, but at least, for instance, we can come up with a stronger, cohesive, ministry level, institution or platform that able to for us to share more, information. Perhaps that might be the case. But the bottom line is that I think leader of ASEAN, should really have the same vision, in a way that we should be one, instead of representing other major power interests. Yeah.
Joanne, what do you think about this? Is it possible, and how would it realistically look like?
So I think Faisal has made many interesting points, and I think they are very important points. So ASEAN has always operated on a consensus-based model, so with no supranational, authority. So while the ASEAN Economic Community Council and the ASEAN Secretariat, which Faisal has mentioned, are tasked with the implementation and monitoring, I think their mandates are actually very limited. So the Secretariat in particular has very modest resources and no real enforcement power. So even the best strategic plans in this case will risk falling short without the very strong sort of a national commitment. So there is definitely a growing recognition that if ASEAN wants to deepen economic integration meaningfully, especially in very complex sector, which Faisal has mentioned earlier, like financial services or even taxation or digital trade, I think it may need to empower a more authoritative sort of a coordinating body to significantly strengthen the Secretariat's role. But politically, I think that's still a very sensitive issue within ASEAN, because member states are very cautious about ceding their sovereignty, right? So, any shift would have to be very incremental, and it has to be built on trust. It cannot be a reform that you take overnight. It needs to be step by step.
As Faisal said, ASEAN should act as one, but going back to what we talked about earlier and with what Daisy mentioned as well, there's so much diversity, so much variation, heterogeneity, if I may, in the regulatory frameworks, the sort of economic market diversification that we're seeing across the entire region. So here we're seeing this balancing act, right, between acting in unison, this need for unity to act as one, but also to celebrate this diversity and variation. Daisy, how do you see this balancing act between the two? Maybe the beauty is in the diversity, but how can ASEAN unite?
Yeah, I think this is very interesting, because actually we face this kind of problem now with this very changing situation. When we face Trump tariff, we face a strategic dilemma. So we respond together collectively, or go alone. And actually, every country have their own approach with these tariffs, right? So this is something that when you talk about diversity and unity, but actually we are have every country have different interests. So and also every country also have different exposure in anything in trade in investment from China, from US, and from and other partners. So they're facing a different situation, and also their condition also different in terms of the regulatory and also the social economic condition. So this is a challenge, I think, for ASEAN, how to still coordinate, collaborate, and communicate. At least we have some common goal. We want to make our region stable, and also have a good economic growth in our region. So we have some common goal, but we are actually different. So this is something that yeah we should as ASEAN discuss and talk together. And I think in ASEAN Summit, Malaysian ASEAN Summit, there are some consensus. At least some leaders actually already tried to have some agreement on these matters.
Yeah. Before we go to that, you mentioned something quite interesting. Joanne, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think that Daisy also made a very important point that various ASEAN member states have different capacities and political appetites. But I think at least, and of course, there is a need to standardize many things and harmonize many regulations. So I'll just maybe state three things that maybe what ASEAN can do to better harmonize. One is, of course, the standards. I think very importantly, ASEAN needs to reduce non-tariff barriers, and then, of course, build more efficient cross-border digital and logistical infrastructure. I think, just these 3 points alone will actually lead to greater harmonization.
Yeah. No, yeah, a lot of interesting points there. And of course, you mentioned the US tariff wars, the trade war with US and China. Again, being united or having a united front, but also at the same time, looking out for their own interests, right? Having bilateral meetings. But if you want to go specifically about that, Malaysia has written to President Donald Trump himself, requesting support to organize a US-ASEAN meeting, of course discussing on tariff pressures. But Trump has also recently announced that the White House, Washington, is no longer entertaining one-on-one trade negotiations, instead unilaterally imposing tariffs. Faisal, again, going back to this balancing act, right, between having a united front, but at the same time looking out for everyone's self-interest, or at least sovereign interest. With the US tariffs, how should they go about it? Is this the right move? Is this the right strategy?
Yeah, I think when it comes again, this is the issue of ASEAN cohesion, despite of the rhetorical, stance that we have. At the end of the day, internal dynamic is the most important problem that ASEAN face, and it's not only the first time. Back in 2016, when there is a crisis between Cambodia and Thailand back then. Also, in 2021, when there is a crisis in Myanmar, ASEAN cohesiveness is being tested, and not to mention about South China Sea, when Philippines unilaterally, try to make China go to a tribunal, things like that. So it's not a new phenomenon that ASEAN has just faced. So it's a recurring, but this time, usually ASEAN was supported by the US when it comes to the so-called ASEAN centrality. Everyone's on board on making ASEAN centrality, because at that time the ASEAN can be seen by the US as a kind of a proxy against China, that are increasingly aggressive in South China Sea. But now I think when Trump has this populist idea, and given the fact that for so long ASEAN get the benefit this kind of balancing in terms of security with China, but at the same time increasingly getting a lot of economic benefit from the US is no longer viable strategy, and somehow we cannot use the same amount kind of a hedging strategy that we always use, right? Because now Trump said, okay, you cannot do that anymore. Now you also need to basically choose, right? You cannot get my economic support all the time. So in this case, we see, and ASEAN was asked to do unilateral negotiation. So for me, this shows that unless ASEAN can present a united front, let's say a clear demands or leverage, which I think that is not the case. I think in terms of economic, we will not see ASEAN as one cohesive front. That's the first thing. And we can see, in case in point, how Indonesia finally tried to kind of a sabotage, right? It's, Singapore-Indonesia oil trade, I think people may know that this is also try to end oil import from Singapore due to, a way to leverage oil imports for the US. So it shows, and it's lack of ASEAN consultations, it's triggered confusion in regional market. Even Singapore perhaps might think this is kind of a, unilateral being done and things like this. So it shows also the limitations of ASEAN to unite as a united economic front. So in a way, I think, that's also, fragmentation and reactive and vulnerability of ASEAN that being shown to us. Yeah.
Joanne, as Faisal said, the markets are confused. Do you think the leaders are just as confused as we are about how to navigate this?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that ASEAN countries are clearly very concerned about the unilateral tariffs. And I think whatever Faisal has mentioned about national priorities as well are very important. So that's why I think ASEAN is going on a two-track approach. So, I mean, of course, every individual countries are doing their own bilateral negotiations with the US, but of course, ASEAN as a bloc, as a grouping, will also need to do something. And I think what Prime Minister Anwar has done is really deserves a commendation, because I think he's clearly trying to maintain open lines of communication and preserve ASEAN's engagement with the US, especially as the region braces for all this, sort of economic fallout from the high tariffs. And it's not just tariffs, it's also technology restrictions, right, under Trump 2.0. But I think the reality is that the Trump's administration seems to be more inclined, towards unilateral trade measures rather than this sort of a multilateral, dialogue as what we have seen. So I think while Malaysia's outreach is quite diplomatically significant, I would say, but it's uncertain how effective it will be. And I think the risk is that ASEAN's invitation could either be ignored or it could be sidelines unless, there are really compelling US interests that is at stake. But I think what Malaysia has actually done well this time is that it has proposed to set up a geo-economic task force, and I think that task force will actually help ASEAN to navigate this increasingly, overlap between trade, technology, and geopolitics. So we call it the trade and geopolitics sort of nexus, that we are seeing now.
Daisy, do you have any thoughts on this, on how to navigate the US tariff wars? I mean, as you mentioned, there's still a lot of great variation in how the countries or the member states want to approach this, but is it possible to perhaps foster greater unity?
Yeah, I think we still face greater uncertainty because we don't know actually President Trump will announce another trade policy with which country and kind of tariff. So we still face great uncertainty in the future, and also if the US proceed the tariff after the pause, the 90 days pause, the ASEAN export will be hit. So currently we still face like 10% tariff, right? But if the tariff, the reciprocal tariff actually proceed, the same country will be hit greatly and not uniformly. And if the if we are a great Hitler differently, and we will maybe any country will have different and the
Yeah.
approach. We still don't know about that. So also in this context, in the ASEAN context, I think ASEAN Malaysia is taking quite a constructive and forward-looking approach because in the summit the ASEAN Malaysia want to strengthen the intra-ASEAN trade to deeper ASEAN integration, and also try to diversify our trade with other countries with the discussion with GCC and China. I think that's a good move, and it's also signaling something that actually ASEAN wants to diversify, and also a signal US. ASEAN is actually quite good. We have a good collaboration in as a region, and also in the ASEAN summit. Also, we also focus on enhanced trade resilience through trade facilitation, digital trade, and reduce intra-regional barriers. So I think even if ASEAN doesn't yet have unified position on the U.S. trade policy, strengthening regional cooperation and diversifying market will help the region to manage external shocks and sustain momentum. Yeah, I think that's quite a good move and forward-looking approach in the ASEAN Summit.
Yeah, as you mentioned, market diversification, and you also pointed out, of course, the ASEAN GCC China. And when we're talking about trade policies from the US, of course, we have to touch on the US-China rivalry. Faisal, your thoughts on the rivalry. How do you think ASEAN is faring in its adherence to the principles of non-alignment and neutrality in this area?
Yeah, I think first of all, I mean, I agree that Malaysia has done a very good job in making sure that we are a united front line. But again, the devil's in the detail. For instance, Indonesia in Malaysia until now has no ambassador to the US. So when we try to show that we are really care about making sure that we are a united front, but who are the people on the ground that doing so? So it's also kind of a missing link, I guess. It's not a big deal in the grand scheme of things, but I think it shows that there is a kind of limitations of what the leader has said at the leader level, and how this can be done at the day to day, and how can we have a person in charge for ASEAN in DC, for instance, trying to lobbying as one united front, other than as a country. I think that is also a kind of a big deal from diplomatic point of view. But again, responding to your question about being a united front and non-aligned, I think this is the question that we really need to ask, because for the past decades, ASEAN has never been asked to really choose, right? So we can keep doing what we are really good at doing, basically trying not to inclusivity, making sure that a bridge building, making sure that everyone's are happy with how we are conducting our business in the region. But surprisingly, this rivalry requires us to choose. And the question then, should we need to choose? There is a third way, like what Macron has always said, right? We are not only required to choose between the US and China, let's say, but we can create our own. The world is big enough, not only depending on these two. So that's why I think there is a kind of a third way I see from the strategic point of view from ASEAN leaders. That's why I think having GCC, what do you call it? Gulf Country Cooperation Council, part of this trilateral. I think this is major. Usually ASEAN do ASEAN +1 and or ASEAN +3, but now it's the whole cooperation of three different regions. So I think whether we can see whether it's going to be really have an impact, but at least there is a symbolic in here. So I think it's time for us, ASEAN, to look at perhaps Latin America, Africa or Europe. Usually we see Europe as a distant cousins of ASEAN, but only working in a normative way. But now I think it becomes increasingly more important. So I think our non-aligned kind of approach should be directed into creating a kind of a new multilateral forum that may not really depending on US or China.
Really interesting points there. And Joanne, you said this is the time for ASEAN to show its relevance to the world, right? And especially with the US-China rivalry, the world is definitely looking to ASEAN. There's definitely a lot more attention. It's gaining a lot more prominence on the global stage. What do you think of this? Do you think ASEAN needs to pick sides, or is there a third way?
No, I think ASEAN continues to walk a tightrope actually in maintaining its principles of neutrality and non-alignment amidst really the deepening US-China rivalry. But it's really getting harder these days because the grouping, I know the grouping wants to remain committed to strategic autonomy and inclusive regionalism, but I think it's really getting a lot more complicated, and member states are really vary widely in their alignments and threat perceptions, right? So of course, there are some countries like the Philippines that are drawing closer to the US, while others wants to maintain very strong economic and strategic ties with China. So despite these sort of differences, I think ASEAN still serves as a convening platform for both powers, which really reinforces its relevance, right? Because we are actually engaging with both sides. But of course, with the rising pressures, whether it's tariffs, tech restrictions, or even maritime tensions, I think the real challenges is whether ASEAN can actually stay united and to really act collectively. And as Faisal has mentioned, diversification is always great. There are a lot of middle powers out there. So there's actually Japan, ROK, that is within the Asia Pacific. And of course, there's also Australia as well. So there's actually France, you mentioned. There's actually EU. There's actually a lot of middle powers out there that ASEAN wants to, collaborate with. And of course, the ASEAN GCC China Summit is probably a way as well for ASEAN to diversify its sort of economic cooperation rather than just relying on, the big economic players.
On that note, Daisy, you mentioned about the significance of the ASEAN GCC and ASEAN GCC China summits. What do you think is what do you think we can make of this inaugural trilateral summit as well, being ASEAN GCC summit, when we're talking about creating this third way, creating new perhaps collaborations with middle powers, with perhaps partners in the global south as well? Some are calling this as the new power block of the global south. Is this really significant? Is it going to perhaps bear some fruits, do you think, Daisy?
Yeah, I would like to add on the neutrality and non-alignment. I think ASEAN should continue to uphold its long-standing principles, but the neutrality doesn't mean disengagement. So I think ASEAN is still pursuing an active, balanced strategy, maintaining open trade and investment ties with many partners, with US, with China. And I think the ASEAN GCC China trilateral meeting during the summit reflect the ASEAN intention to diversify partnership and strengthen regional cooperation, not just the traditional powers, but also the emerging bloc. I think ASEAN has taken the important steps to show the world that actually we cannot we can still be neutral, but we can still try to be open and have partnered with every partner, including US and China, and we still also can try to be partner with other countries as well.
Earlier, Joanne, you mentioned about how Malaysia is quite strategic in keeping open lines of communication. We were talking about the US tariffs with US-China rivalry, but I do want to quickly touch on the Myanmar crisis as well. Talking about having open lines of communication, I believe that's quite similar to how UNWA is trying to approach the Myanmar crisis, having had engagements with both sides in Myanmar, right? Some see this as a new and much needed approach, a fresh take on negotiations that have been quite slow, of course, in peace efforts in Myanmar. Do you think this is the right move to engage both parties? Obviously, some are criticizing as well, saying that this is giving perhaps more legitimacy to the military junta. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel that Prime Minister Anwar's approach to the Myanmar crisis reflects actually quite a pragmatic and quiet diplomacy, right? I mean that, Malaysia can bring as an ASEAN chair. So, I mean, instead of relying on very loud condemnation or formal mechanism alone, I think Malaysia has pushed for like back channel engagement, meeting with actually both the junta and also the opposition representatives. And of course, I think something new that Anwar has done is to set up an informal advisory group led by former Thai Prime Minister Thaksin. I think this efforts, I mean, is actually also supported by figures like the Brunei Sultan and also the former Cambodia Prime Minister Hun Sen. This kind of approach helps to keep the door open for eventual, dialogue when the conditions are actually more conducive. So I think Prime Minister Anwar has actually put it that way. He said that even a fragile breach is better than a widening gulf, right? So it's actually, I wouldn't say it's a breakthrough yet, but I think it's actually a start and, perhaps a more realistic one, given how ASEAN, I mean, how stuck ASEAN has been on this matter. I mean, it's already been 4 years.
Yeah. Faisal, what do you make of this quiet engagement? Is it too soon to call it a breakthrough?
Well, I think again, from the beginning, this is ASEAN way of dealing with issue, right? We are not naming and shaming kind of approach like in the US or in the Western countries in general, pressuring. What we really wanted to do is mediating regional security tension, especially if it's on our backyard. We try to engage. Of course, people might say ASEAN is always progressing through process, right? But sometimes is it process as a goal or is it process as a mean? And some people say that's the goal of having a lot of a process, but at the end of the day it will resolve eventually. And I think despite of the limitations of this kind of approach, it's a slow, it's quiet, a lot of people not having a patience to do so. But I think it might works in long terms because I think in the ground, there is slightly change. The junta is increasingly more, more being embraced by its regional counterparts instead of being, alienated. So in a way, I think Malaysia bring back this kind of mediating approach, which I think, in my personal view, this is what we need to do because we are not like EU that have a strong institution. We cannot, the 5P consensus is a good balancing act. We cannot just isolate Myanmar, and I think time will tell. Of course, there is no solution yet in sight, but time will tell whether this is going to be a good decision. But I think, in my personal point of view, is a way of dealing with ASEAN countries, Naila.
Daisy, going to that point about what Faisal said, this is how ASEAN has always dealt with internal crises, perhaps, right? And looking at the Myanmar crisis, with the 5-point consensus and perhaps what has changed a little bit this time around, having both parties not yet at the table, but heading to that direction. Do you think this is the right track for ASEAN?
Yeah, I think actually ASEAN still do something right by facilitating dialogue, humanitarian assistance, but the progress may be still limited. Yeah, like Joan and Faisal mentioned before, that this is the ASEAN way, that we cannot just push Myanmar and other parties to do some things. We do it in ASEAN way. So, but we hope it will.
Yeah.
I don't know how can yeah, we the lack of tangible outcomes underscore the need for more robust mechanism to address this crisis effectively. And I think the yeah, we need more coordination on this thing.
think
Okay.
just two quick things on this. One is I think ASEAN needs an implementation roadmap. The 5-point consensus, unfortunately, is so broad. It needs some finer details on what you can do and what you can implement. And second is to have a longer term special envoy. You don't want to have a new person every year. And I think this is what Prime Minister Anwar has said that he's going to look into, which is a longer term special envoy. Once you have these two up, I think you can get things going.
Yeah, much needed, I think, because it has been 4 years after all. Do you think it's moving at a speed it should be, or is this how, it's a tricky conflict and it takes time for sure, but do you think they need to act with greater urgency, perhaps?
Of course,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, I think adding on that, I think again, ASEAN should also make a clear benchmark for progress. So, 4 years, 5-point consensus, how this will be assessed as a successful, whether we need to suspend political representation if there is no compliance, or perhaps there is an incentive if there is a one progress one of the 5-point consensus. So I think setting clear benchmark is also kind of a important setup, I think, that perhaps Malaysia can do.
Yeah. Apart from the Myanmar crisis, of course, looking internally, ASEAN is also looking at the South China Sea dispute, with Philippines calling on ASEAN to fast-track a code of conduct for the South China Sea, urging member states to play a stronger role in the US-China power rivalry. But it seems like Philippines is always rather alone in these calls. Faisal, what do you make of this?
I totally agree. I think this is where ASEAN is lagging behind, despite of having talk from 1990s with the notion of code of conduct with China, and we can see how China wanted to do it bilaterally instead of multilaterally, while ASEAN wanted to do this through dialogue, multilateral. So in a way, I think in order to do a fast track, I think again there will be a kind of a way for us to approach this so-called China divide and rule tactics, because I think we can argue that ASEAN 5, the original member basically are on side with Philippines. We want to do this, multilaterally. We want to basically do a consensus on this, but the problem is a bigger ASEAN countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, or perhaps these small new member ASEAN countries are kind of buying this China divide and tactics, and I think this also reflect the fragmentation within ASEAN, where basically some countries are more vocal, Philippines, Vietnam, and to some extent Indonesia as well, and also Malaysia, but at the same time they need to understand that the smaller countries are more accommodating. So in here we see, I think one thing for sure, we need to have a strengthening coordination mechanism, right? Also, despite of the diversity and fragmentation within ASEAN, I think we need to lobby more. How important this is for all of the ASEAN, and I think having this more in-depth engagement diplomatic, which I think lacking nowadays, because perhaps people are more interested in leaders meeting, leaders retreat. But at the end of the day, the one that is more important is how we maintain, the line of communications, day to day, diplomacy with other ASEAN countries, to make sure that they shift their perception on this China. And I think it's more important to make this Cambodian, ASEAN member state to know the importance of having code of conduct with China in South China Sea. Yeah.
Joanne, your thoughts on this? This is another point of fragmentation for the member states. How would greater coordination look like in this issue?
Yeah, so Faiza actually illustrated the real situation on the ground because it is really complex. The code of conduct process has been stuck, in a prolonged deadlock, I would say, not just because of China's uncompromising position, but really, as what he said, is due to the deep internal divisions within ASEAN itself. Because, some claimant states like the Philippines, they have grown more assertive, as we have seen. They have bolstered their defense partnerships with other major powers, while others, of course, they prefer a more cautious status quo sort of approach. So the result is exactly like Faiza, you say, fragmented ASEAN, that lacks the internal consensus and the political will to move the COC forward in any meaningful way. So while the Philippines call is very important, but unless ASEAN rethinks its strategy, the process really risks losing credibility altogether. And incidentally, I also just published a paper today. The title of the paper is called The Elusive Code, Why ASEAN Needs a New Playbook. So in case, and I have put up 5 recommendations in the paper, we don't have time for me to go through all those things. But in case you are interested, that paper is a perspective piece on the ISIS Yusof Ishak Institute website.
Thanks, Joanne. I'll be sure to read that. We are coming towards the end now, but I think you ended there on quite a good note about this need for a new playbook for ASEAN, right? And we talked quite at length about what we want to see, what we hope to see for the next 20 years in line with the ASEAN Community Vision 2054, but 2045. But talking about just what we want to see, perhaps we can keep it quite short term. We've got quite some time now, about another half of the year. As Joanne said, it's quite unprecedented that a lot of the documents, a lot of the visions has been set out in just the earlier part of the year with the ASEAN Summit. But for the next 6 months now, Daisy, what do you think we'll see with ASEAN for the remaining half of 2025?
Yeah, I think the uncertainty condition, geopolitical condition is still uncertain until until the next 4 years, I think. So this is something that ASEAN still try to maybe discuss in next 6 months when the tariff is actually implemented, and every ASEAN countries will be hit hard by the tariff, and then the situation will maybe quite different, and yeah, and and I think the discussion on the geopolitical and the trade tension, I think, still ongoing on this year.
Joanne, lastly, what do you think we can look out for the remaining few months with Malaysia's chairmanship of ASEAN?
I'm definitely looking forward to the second ASEAN Summit in October because that's when Timor-Leste is going to be officially a member of ASEAN. Just like to see that sort of dynamic, and also that summit will involve all the external partners of ASEAN. You're going to have the East Asia Summit, and you're going to have the world leaders sitting together, and then it will be interesting, to see what sort of dynamics that will come out from it, like in the midst of all this economic fragmentation and geopolitical tension. So I'm actually looking forward to that second summit, actually.
And Faisal, some parting words, what we can look out for the next few months?
I think the most important perhaps when it comes to ASEAN is the Myanmar military junta. I think they wanted to create elections, right? So, the planned election by the military junta, perhaps the most important, challenge perhaps for ASEAN, whether, it will lead to, legitimacy crisis where junta finally, basically do not put democratic agenda in place, or perhaps it it brings, a hope where basically Myanmar can be on path of democracy anymore. So in a way, I think we need to see how Anwar Ibrahim's role, positioning ASEAN and to particularly Malaysia as a leader might pay off, with the quiet diplomacy, with firm principle. Hopefully it pays off, and we see a 5-point consensus to be a fruitful in the coming month, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot to look out for sure, and a lot of uncertainty ahead, but at least we have Joanne's new playbook for ASEAN to help us see how we can navigate these waters. Thank you so much to our panelists, Joanne, Faisal and Daisy, for your time today on Dialog ASEAN25, sharing your thoughts and insights on how ASEAN has been faring and how we can see ASEAN navigating its pathway for the future. Thank you once again for joining us on Dialog ASEAN25 with me, Nala Huda. We'll catch you another time.